Okay, afternoon everybody. Great to have Caleb with us, and he was in New Zealand for a while doing training with YWAM, and because of the COVID situation, you've come back, but we're glad to have you back. So it's worked out for good. It's been a blessing to our church and our young people. So we're just going to have a little chat about culture, because that's one thing you've been studying, and obviously you've seen other cultures in some of the trips you've done. Maybe we could just start with what are some of the countries you've had the chance to visit in going on short-term missions, Caleb?
Yeah, so over the past, I think, 4 and a bit years, I've been overseas doing missions every now and then, just short-term trips thus far. The first one I did was to India and Nepal, which are 2 largely Hindu countries. And then a year and a bit after that, I did a trip where we went to 5 different countries and saw a pretty vast myriad of different places, such as Thailand, India again, Romania, South Africa, then Argentina, which spreads out pretty far across the world and pretty much hits every main world religion in there as well.
Yeah, okay, great. So one thing that is sometimes said, that if we want to evangelize, whether it's on the foreign mission field or whether it's reaching people at a university or next door from another culture, it's sometimes said that we need to do some research and learn a bit about their culture. Now, some people might say, I don't need to do that, I just go full on with the gospel from day one. What would you say, but some of the things you've been learning about culture, is it important to learn a little bit about a person's religion and their culture in helping us to be better prepared to reach out with the gospel?
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to learn about culture. Learning a new culture is almost like learning a new language. It's learning a way to communicate with people. Most of what we do is steeped in our own culture. A couple of mistakes that early missionaries made when they went places was not identifying, not actually finding a way to reach people within their own culture. They essentially brought Western culture with them in their missions. So when they planted churches in places like island nations in the Pacific, they weren't embracing that culture and trying to find a way of doing church within that culture. When they planted a church, they would bring basically like a Western church model.
Yeah.
So you'd find these people who were wearing like pretty Pacific Islander type of wear and clothes during the whole week, and on that one Sunday of the week they would be wearing a full suit, preaching a sermon with a microphone to a very small church.
Yes.
So I think the best way I heard this explained is that, like, think of the gospel as a tree. If you want to plant that tree in a garden, you don't take any soil with it, you just put that tree straight in the garden. Potentially, I'm not too well versed in gardening, but what you do when you bring your own culture with the gospel and surround it with it, you're basically just bringing a tree within a pot and planting that within a garden. You're creating a sect of your own culture. Which isn't as effective. People don't seem to identify with that. Our Western church model is just that. It's a Western way of doing church. It doesn't reflect the native culture, and people are less likely to get into it. So when you plant a church, you want to figure out a way of doing church within that native culture. And it's the same with evangelism as well. You need to get to know that person's culture, get to know the best way to communicate with them. In the West, we are a very logic-based society, logical and rational thinking. In other countries, it's not always as logic and rational thinking.
Okay.
If you try to argue someone into the kingdom and say, hey, this is actually the faults in your own religion, here are the good things about mine, that would work within a Western culture sometimes, but not necessarily in an Eastern culture or within the majority world.
Yeah. What would be a better approach if you're trying to reach someone from an Eastern culture?
So what they've learned is that a lot of these cultures are much more about relational evangelism. So building a friendship with a person and using that friendship to introduce them to the friendship that we have with God, essentially. In other places, it can be about figuring out what window in their own culture there is actually to God already. Because if we think about it, all cultures in the world have stemmed back to the Tower of Babel. It's where all the nations came out from. So everybody actually originated in that same place in Genesis, in that same small community back then. So you'll find, as you learn other cultures and you learn other faiths, there are actual, like these little remnants of that initial story that you can use as a window to open them up to our God. So really effective way of reaching Muslims is just teaching them through the Old Testament.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah.
You can say, oh, what do you think about Jesus? Because Jesus also exists within the Quran.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really helpful. So if we sort of go into evangelizing, whether overseas or locally, with an ignorance of this, we're probably going to learn the hard way.
Yeah,
And we're going to be reinventing the wheel all the time. So
basically, and it can cause offence pretty quickly. Very small things can happen that can cause offence in other cultures. I think one of the first missionaries who came to Vanuatu, he had a comb with him, and the local chief grabbed the comb from him and put it in his own hair. And the missionary, kind of thinking of this as a bit of a funny thing happening, went to reach and grab the comb out of the chief's hair, and was basically immediately struck down, because the head in that culture and many others around the world is considered like a really sacred place, and the head of a chief, nobody touches that. So the missionary was killed because of it. So really small things, not that happens today in other cultures around the world, but little small things can cause great offence. You need to learn about these small things.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Carl. So this is really, really helpful information. So, and again, because other cultures are coming into the West, we need some of this information for local evangelism, not only for someone considering career missionary work. So, yeah, thanks for sharing those insights with us.
No worries.